Hello, dear history travelers, and welcome back to another journey into the darkest corridors of royal power. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend your time here with me today as we explore one of history's most tragic patterns, how the world's most powerful families engineered their own destruction from within. Before we descend into these tales of bloodlines cursed by their own choices, I want to ask for your support. If you enjoy these deep explorations into the hidden tragedies of history, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these carefully researched, nuanced stories to light. Also, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me which royal dynasty you'd like us to investigate next. Every comment is read and helps shape our content. Now, settle into a comfortable space, perhaps dim the lights, and prepare to witness how absolute power, when combined with fatal family decisions, can bring down empires that should have lasted forever. Let's discover how royal families destroyed themselves. Imagine being born into ultimate power. Your bloodline stretches back centuries, blessed by God and recognized by every nation. Vast armies defend your throne. Elaborate palaces house your family. The wealth of entire continents flows through your treasury. You are, quite literally, at the pinnacle of human achievement and authority. Now imagine that your greatest enemy isn't a rival kingdom, a revolutionary movement, or a foreign invasion. Your greatest enemy is sitting across from you at the dinner table. Your greatest threat shares your blood. The seeds of your dynasty's destruction are growing in your own family tree, planted by your ancestors' choices and watered by decisions you'll make yourself. This isn't fiction. This is the recurring tragedy of royal dynasties throughout history. The Habsburg jaw, a genetic deformity so severe that the last Spanish Habsburg couldn't chew his own food and died without heirs, ending one of history's greatest empires. This wasn't caused by war or plague. It was caused by generations of Habsburg cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, keeping power in the family until the family itself became unsustainable. The Romanovs, rulers of the vast Russian Empire for 3 centuries, who isolated themselves so completely from their own people that they didn't realize revolution was coming until it was too late, who trusted a mad monk over their experienced advisors, who made decision after catastrophic decision, each one bringing them closer to that basement in Ekaterinburg where their dynasty ended in bullets and blood. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, who practiced sibling marriage for nearly 3 centuries, creating a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a tangle of roots feeding back into themselves, until Cleopatra, brilliant, capable, and doomed, became the last of a line destroyed by its own genetic desperation. These aren't isolated cases. Throughout history, royal families have followed remarkably similar paths to self-destruction. They intermarried with close relatives to keep power concentrated, creating genetic catastrophes that rendered their descendants unable to rule or even survive. They betrayed each other in civil wars and succession disputes, murdering brothers, imprisoning fathers, poisoning rivals, until the family had bled itself white. They isolated themselves from reality in gilded palaces, surrounded by sycophants who told them what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know, until they were blindsided by revolutions they never saw coming. They made catastrophic decisions based on pride, tradition, or wounded ego rather than practical wisdom, choosing symbolic victories that led to real defeats. Today, we're going to explore several of history's most powerful royal families and dissect exactly how they destroyed themselves. We'll meet the Habsburgs and their genetic nightmare. We'll witness the Romanovs' tragic blindness. We'll examine the Wars of the Roses that nearly destroyed the English monarchy. We'll see how the French Bourbons' arrogance led to the guillotine, and we'll discover the common patterns that connect these seemingly different stories of dynastic suicide. These are cautionary tales about the dangers of absolute power, closed systems, and the fatal belief that blood and tradition matter more than competence and adaptation. They're stories of families who had everything and lost it all, not to superior enemies, but to their own choices, their own pride, their own inability to see that the rules ensuring their rise were now engineering their fall. Prepare yourself for a journey through the self-inflicted wounds of royalty, the betrayals that shattered bloodlines, and the tragic inevitability of dynasties that carried the seeds of their own destruction in their very DNA. Let us begin with perhaps the most literally self-destructive royal family in European history, the House of Habsburg, whose obsession with keeping power within the family created a genetic catastrophe that culminated in a king who could barely function and whose death ended the Spanish Habsburg line forever. The Habsburg dynasty rose to prominence in the 13th century and through strategic marriages rather than military conquest built one of Europe's greatest empires. Their motto, Bella Gerant Ali, tu Felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, reflected their strategy perfectly. By the 16th century, the Habsburgs ruled Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, much of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and vast territories in the Americas. When Charles V inherited all these domains in 1519, he ruled an empire on which the sun never set, literally. The Habsburg Empire was the superpower of its age. This success came through marriages. Generation after generation, Habsburgs married their children to other royals, accumulating territories through inheritance. It was brilliant strategy until they took it too far. The problems began when the Habsburgs started marrying each other, not just arranged marriages to distant royals, but systematic, repeated marriages between close relatives within their own family. Uncle-niece marriages became common. First cousins married regularly. The family tree began to look less like a tree and more like a ladder, with the same names appearing over and over at different levels because the same genetic material kept cycling through the family. Why did they do this? Several reasons. Political control. Every time a Habsburg married outside the immediate family, territories and power had to be shared with another dynasty. Marrying within the family kept everything Habsburg. Religious purity. The Habsburgs were fanatically Catholic. Marrying other Catholics ensured religious uniformity, but the pool of acceptable Catholic royals was limited. Territorial integrity. They feared fragmenting the empire. If a Habsburg princess married a French prince, might part of the empire eventually pass to France? Better to marry her to her uncle and keep everything in Habsburg hands. Tradition and pride. After several generations, inbreeding became tradition. The Habsburgs believed their blood was special, uniquely qualified to rule. Mixing it with lesser blood seemed wrong. This strategy worked brilliantly for accumulating power. It worked catastrophically for producing healthy heirs. The genetic catastrophe unfolds. The effects of inbreeding accumulated slowly, over generations, like a debt that compounds with interest. Early Habsburgs showed minor effects, slight jaw protrusions, fertility problems, some stillbirths. Concerning, but not catastrophic. But each generation that married close relatives added to the genetic burden. The Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, became increasingly pronounced. This wasn't just cosmetic, it affected the ability to chew food, speak clearly, and in severe cases to close the mouth fully. Portraits of later Habsburgs show the progression, jaws jutting forward, lower lips protruding, faces becoming increasingly distorted. Infant mortality skyrocketed. Of the 34 children born to Philip IV of Spain and his 2 wives, both of whom were close relatives, only 7 survived to adulthood. That's an 80% mortality rate, far higher than the already high infant mortality of the era. Mental instability increased. Several Habsburg rulers showed signs of serious mental illness. Juana of Castile, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, is the most famous example, but she wasn't alone. Physical weakness became endemic. Later Habsburgs were frequently sick, weak, prone to infections, unable to engage in the physical activities expected of kings. Fertility problems multiplied. Many Habsburg marriages produced no children, or children who died young. The dynasty that had accumulated territory through strategic marriages was now unable to produce the heirs needed to continue those marriages. All of these problems culminated in the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, whose very existence demonstrated what happens when a family gene pool becomes too shallow. Charles II was born in 1661, the long-awaited son and heir of Philip IV. His birth was celebrated across the Spanish Empire, finally a male heir to continue the line. But Charles was disabled from birth. He had the worst case of Habsburg jaw ever recorded. His lower jaw protruded so far that his teeth couldn't meet, making it almost impossible for him to chew. He had to have his food pre-mashed. He drooled constantly because he couldn't close his mouth properly. He didn't speak until age 4. He didn't walk until age 8. His head was described as being too large for his body. He had frequent seizures. He was probably intellectually disabled, though accounts vary. He suffered from chronic diarrhea and was sickly his entire life. He had an enlarged tongue, macroglossia, that further impaired his speech. Observers noted he seemed barely conscious much of the time. His genetic coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that typically seen in children of parent-child incest. His parents' tree was so entangled that he had only 8 great-grandparents instead of the normal 8. His parents were uncle and niece, and themselves the products of similar unions. Charles's father was his mother's uncle. His mother was simultaneously his aunt and his mother. His 2 grandfathers were the same person. His 2 grandmothers were sisters. The family tree folded back on itself repeatedly. Despite 2 marriages, both to close relatives continuing the pattern, Charles II produced no children. He was likely sterile, a common result of severe inbreeding. As he aged and it became clear he would have no heirs, all of Europe watched and waited. The Spanish Habsburg Empire would have to be partitioned among other powers. The question of succession dominated European politics for decades. Charles II died on November 1, 1900, 1 month before his 39th birthday. He was the last Spanish Habsburg. An autopsy revealed his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a devastating conflict that reshaped European power politics. The Spanish Habsburg Empire, which had seemed eternal, was partitioned among other powers. Interestingly, the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs survived into the 20th century. Why? Because they were slightly less obsessive about inbreeding, marrying outside the immediate family more frequently. They still practiced cousin marriage and had genetic issues, but not to the catastrophic degree of the Spanish branch. This demonstrates that the Habsburg destruction was self-inflicted, not inevitable given their position, but a direct consequence of specific choices about marriage and bloodlines. The Austrian Habsburgs fell in 1918, not from genetic collapse, but from World War I. But even they never fully recovered the glory of the empire Charles V had assembled. The Spanish branch's self-destruction had weakened the entire dynasty. The Habsburgs' story teaches several painful lessons about power and heredity. Closed systems fail. When you limit your gene pool, or your talent pool, or your idea pool too much, you create fragility. The Habsburgs were so concerned with keeping power in the family that they created a family unable to hold power. Short-term success can create long-term disaster. For several generations, inbreeding seemed to work. Territories accumulated, power concentrated. The problems accumulated invisibly until they were irreversible. Pride blinds. Habsburg portraits show the jaw becoming increasingly deformed. They knew there were problems, but pride and tradition prevented them from changing course. They believed their blood was special enough to overcome genetics. Institutions can't survive without viable leaders. The Spanish Empire had excellent institutions, experienced administrators, and vast resources. But when the king at the top was Charles II, none of that mattered. Leadership matters. Genetic debt always comes due. You can delay the consequences of inbreeding for a few generations, but the debt compounds. Each generation of cousin marriage added to the burden the next generation would carry. The House of Habsburg destroyed itself through an obsession with purity and control that turned their greatest strength, strategic marriage, into their greatest weakness. They created an empire through bloodlines and destroyed that empire through those same bloodlines. Charles II, unable to eat, speak clearly, or produce heirs, his body racked by the accumulated genetic burden of generations of inbreeding, stands as history's most tragic example of a royal family engineering its own destruction through the very strategy that had brought it to power. The Habsburgs proved that you can win every battle for political supremacy and still lose the war for dynastic survival if you fight that war against the laws of genetics. Some enemies, like genetic entropy, cannot be defeated through political brilliance, military might, or royal prerogative. They can only be avoided through wisdom the Habsburgs fatally lacked. From the genetic catastrophe of the Habsburgs, we turn to a different kind of self-destruction. The Romanovs of Russia, a dynasty that isolated itself so completely from reality that it walked blindly into revolution and annihilation. The Romanov dynasty began in 1613 when Michael Romanov was elected Tsar during the time of troubles. For 3 centuries, the Romanovs ruled Russia, transforming it from a medieval kingdom into a vast empire stretching from Poland to the Pacific. Peter the Great modernized Russia, building St. Petersburg as a window to the West. Catherine the Great expanded the empire and presided over a cultural flowering. Alexander I defeated Napoleon. Russia became one of Europe's great powers, a continental empire of enormous size and resources. The Romanovs seemed unassailable. They ruled autocratically, claiming divine right, commanding vast armies, and controlling the world's largest country. What could possibly threaten such power? The answer: themselves. The seeds of isolation. The Romanovs' fatal mistake was creating a bubble of unreality around themselves, a bubble that grew thicker and more impenetrable with each generation. After the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, when reform-minded officers tried to prevent Nicholas I's succession, the Romanovs became paranoid about their own nobility and military. They responded with repression, creating a secret police and censorship apparatus. But repression created a problem. The Romanovs could no longer get accurate information about their own empire. Officials told them what they wanted to hear, not what they needed to know. Problems were hidden rather than reported. The royal family isolated itself in magnificent palaces, surrounded by elaborate court protocol that separated them from ordinary Russians. They lived in a world of balls, ceremonies, and rituals that had little connection to the empire they supposedly ruled. This isolation had consequences. When discontent simmered, they didn't see it. When reforms were needed, they didn't know what kind. When revolution was building, they assumed it was just a few troublemakers. The tragedy of the Romanovs culminated in Nicholas II, who became Tsar in 1894. Nicholas was not evil or deliberately cruel. He was simply catastrophically unsuited for autocratic rule and too isolated to understand his own inadequacy. Nicholas was a devoted family man, loving husband, caring father. His diaries show him as kind and thoughtful. But these personal virtues didn't translate to effective rulership. He believed absolutely in autocracy, that he was God's appointed ruler of Russia, answerable to no one but God. This wasn't mere arrogance, it was his sincere worldview, shaped by tradition and isolation. But believing you're divinely appointed doesn't make you capable of managing a vast, complex, modernizing empire facing enormous social, economic, and political pressures. Nicholas made catastrophic decisions, often from a place of sincere conviction that he was doing right. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, Nicholas underestimated Japan, expecting an easy victory that would unite Russia behind him. Instead, Russia suffered humiliating defeats that revealed military incompetence and sparked the 1905 revolution. Bloody Sunday, 1905. When peaceful protesters came to petition Nicholas, soldiers fired on them, killing hundreds. Nicholas wasn't present and probably didn't order the massacre, but his isolation meant he didn't understand what was happening or how to respond. The massacre shattered the image of the Tsar as the people's father. The October Manifesto. After the 1905 revolution, Nicholas reluctantly granted a constitution and parliament, Duma, but he never accepted these limitations on his power and constantly worked to undermine them. This antagonized reformers without satisfying revolutionaries. World War I. Nicholas's decision to enter World War I alongside France and Britain was probably correct given Russia's alliances, but his management of the war was disastrous. In 1915, he took personal command of the armies, a symbolic gesture that made him personally responsible for every subsequent defeat. Each decision seemed reasonable to Nicholas within his isolated worldview. Each was catastrophic in reality. Nothing exemplifies the Romanovs' self-destructive isolation better than their relationship with Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk. Nicholas and Alexandra had one son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disease, possibly ironically caused by royal inbreeding among European families, that prevented his blood from clotting. Any injury could be fatal. Rasputin, a Siberian mystic with dubious credentials, seemed able to help Alexei during bleeding episodes. How he did this is debated, possibly through hypnosis and calming the boy, which might have helped. Whatever the mechanism, Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was saving her son's life. This gave Rasputin enormous influence over the royal family. He advised on appointments, policy, and decisions. His recommendations were increasingly bizarre and often served his own interests or those of people bribing him. Here's the tragic isolation. Everyone in Russia, from peasants to nobles to the Duma to the royal family's own relatives, knew that Rasputin was a disaster. His influence over the Tsarina and through her, the Tsar, was common knowledge. His debauchery, corruption, and terrible advice were obvious to everyone, except Nicholas and Alexandra. In their isolated bubble, supported by a few sycophants, they believed Rasputin was a holy man sent by God to save their son. They dismissed all criticism as malicious gossip or political opposition. When a group of nobles finally assassinated Rasputin in 1916 to save the monarchy, Nicholas and Alexandra were devastated. They saw it as persecution of a holy man, not desperate patriots trying to avert catastrophe. This is the depth of their isolation. The entire country could see the problem, but those at the very center, those with the power to fix it, were blind. By early 1917, Russia was collapsing. The war was going badly, food shortages plagued cities, workers were striking, soldiers were deserting. The entire system was breaking down, and Nicholas, in his palace bubble, thought everything was manageable. He believed discontent was limited to a few troublemakers, that his people still loved him, that order would be restored. When bread riots began in Petrograd in February 1917, Nicholas was at military headquarters away from the capital. He received reports that made the situation seem minor, again officials telling him what he wanted to hear. When the riots grew, he ordered them suppressed. When told that even the soldiers were joining the protesters, he didn't believe it could be serious. By the time Nicholas understood the situation, it was too late. The Duma was declaring a provisional government, the army commanders were recommending abdication. The entire structure of power had collapsed. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. And even then, he didn't truly understand what had happened. He thought perhaps things would calm down, that he and his family might live quietly in the Crimea, that Russia would continue under a constitutional monarchy. The Romanovs story ended on July 17, 1918 in Ekaterinburg, in a basement room where Bolshevik executioners murdered Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and several servants. The revolution had progressed to civil war. The Bolsheviks held the family prisoner. With white forces, anti-Bolshevik, approaching the city, local Bolshevik leaders decided to execute the entire family to prevent their rescue. The execution was botched. Some family members survived the initial shooting and had to be bayoneted or shot at point-blank range. The daughters had sewn jewels into their clothing for safekeeping, and these jewels deflected some bullets, prolonging their agony. The bodies were disposed of in a mine shaft, then moved, burned, disfigured with acid, and buried in a secret location. The Bolsheviks wanted to eliminate not just the Romanovs, but any chance of their remains becoming martyrs' relics. For 73 years, the location remained secret. Only in 1991, after the Soviet Union's collapse, were the remains found, identified through DNA testing, and given proper burial. The broader family's fate. The Romanov dynasty extended beyond Nicholas's immediate family. Dozens of Grand Dukes, Grand Duchesses, and relatives existed in 1917. The Bolsheviks systematically hunted and killed them. 18 Romanovs were murdered in 1918 alone, including Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke Michael, his sister, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, who had become a nun, and numerous cousins. Some escaped into exile, but these survivors were scattered, impoverished, fighting among themselves about who was the rightful heir. The dynasty was shattered. How the Romanovs destroyed themselves. The Romanovs' self-destruction was more psychological than genetic. They destroyed themselves through willful blindness. They created systems that prevented them from seeing reality. They chose to believe comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths. Rigid ideology. Nicholas's absolute belief in autocracy prevented him from adapting to changing circumstances. He saw any limitation in his power as a betrayal of his sacred duty. Isolation from competent advice. They surrounded themselves with sycophants and dismissed capable advisors who told them unwelcome truths. Inability to learn. After the 1905 revolution, they should have learned that reform was necessary. Instead, they grudgingly made minimal changes and tried to take them back at the first opportunity. Mistaking symbols for substance. They thought that because they were Tsars, crowned and anointed, they were secure. They didn't understand that power is more than ceremony and title. Personal loyalty over competence. Alexandra's loyalty to Rasputin because he helped her son overrode all rational assessment of his impact on the monarchy. The truly tragic aspect is that none of this was inevitable. Russia had capable people who could have led reforms. The monarchy could have evolved into a constitutional system. The dynasty could have survived. But the Romanovs' choices to isolate, to resist change, to believe their own mythology, to prioritize autocracy over survival made their destruction nearly inevitable. They didn't just fail to prevent revolution, they actively created the conditions that made revolution necessary and their own annihilation possible. They walked into the basement at Ekaterinburg, having paved that path themselves with decisions made in gilded isolation, each one bringing them closer to that final, bloody night. From dynasties destroyed by genetics and isolation, we turn to a royal family that nearly destroyed itself through civil war and betrayal, the Plantagenets of England, whose internal feuding in the Wars of the Roses eliminated so many family members that the dynasty couldn't sustain itself. The Plantagenet dynasty ruled England from 1154 to 1485, over 3 centuries of mostly successful monarchy. They created parliament, developed common law, built magnificent cathedrals and castles, and expanded English power in France and Wales. By the early 15th century, England was a major European power. The Plantagenets seemed secure. But beneath the surface, succession problems and family rivalries were creating fault lines that would explode into devastating civil war. The problems began with Richard II's deposition in 1399. Richard was legitimate king, descended directly from Edward III. But he ruled badly, made enemies among the nobility, and was overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. This established a dangerous precedent. A legitimate king could be deposed if he ruled poorly, and another branch of the royal family could seize the throne. Henry IV was from the Lancastrian branch, descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edward III's third son. But there were other branches with equally valid or better claims. The Yorkists, descended from Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, Edward III's fourth son, and the Mortimer line, descended through Edward III's second son's daughter. For several decades, this didn't matter much. Henry IV and his son Henry V ruled effectively. Henry V's victories in France, Agincourt, 1415, united England behind the Lancastrian dynasty. But then Henry V died young in 1422, leaving an infant heir, Henry VI. And Henry VI, as he grew, proved to be pious, gentle, generous, and completely unsuited to medieval kingship. Henry VI was possibly the worst king England ever had, through no fault of his own. He was kind, religious, founded schools and colleges, Eton, King's College, Cambridge, and wanted peace. But he was also weak-willed, easily manipulated, prone to mental illness. He had episodes where he became catatonic for months, and unable to control his nobles or manage government. Under Henry VI, England lost all the French territories Henry V had conquered. Nobles competed for influence over the weak king. The government became corrupt and ineffective. Different factions formed around strong personalities who could lead where the king couldn't. By the 1450s, England was badly governed, losing a war in France and facing economic problems. Something had to give. Richard, Duke of York, was the wealthiest and most powerful noble in England. He also had a claim to the throne that was arguably better than Henry VI's through the Mortimer line. Initially, he just wanted to reform the government and exclude corrupt advisors from influence. But the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, saw York as a threat to her son's inheritance. She became the real power behind the Lancastrian throne, protecting her weak husband and ensuring her son would inherit. The conflict escalated. York tried to seize control of government. Margaret outmaneuvered him. York raised an army. Margaret raised a larger army. Small skirmishes became battles. Battles became a war. In 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans marked the beginning of open conflict. York defeated Lancastrian forces and captured Henry VI, but he didn't claim the throne yet. He tried to rule as protector for the incapacitated king. This pattern repeated. York would win a battle and try to control the government. Margaret would rally forces and win the next battle. Back and forth, year after year, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. What made the Wars of the Roses truly destructive was that both sides were branches of the same family. This wasn't England fighting France or monarchy fighting rebellion. This was Plantagenets killing Plantagenets. The battles were vicious. Captured nobles were often executed after battles rather than ransomed, the normal practice. York executed Lancastrian lords. Lancastrians executed York supporters. The blood feud intensified. Richard of York was killed in battle in 1460. His head was cut off and displayed wearing a paper crown, mocking his royal ambitions. His son Edward took up the cause. Edward IV was everything his Yorkist supporters could hope for. Tall, handsome, charismatic, an excellent military commander.
In 1461, at age 18, he won a crushing victory at Towton, possibly the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, with perhaps 28,000 men killed in a single day. Edward IV deposed Henry VI and became king. The Yorkist line had won. Or so it seemed. Edward IV ruled successfully for a decade, but then he made catastrophic mistakes that reignited the Civil War. Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow, for love. This enraged his chief supporter, the Earl of Warwick, who'd been negotiating a French marriage for Edward. He felt betrayed. Edward then elevated Elizabeth's large family to positions of power, creating resentment among established nobles who'd fought for the Yorkist cause. Warwick, feeling insulted and sidelined, did the unthinkable. He switched sides. The kingmaker, who had put Edward on the throne, now allied with Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrians to restore Henry VI. This temporarily succeeded. Edward fled to exile. Henry VI was restored, though still mentally feeble and completely controlled by his wife and Warwick. But Edward regrouped, invaded, and defeated and killed Warwick in battle. Edward then had Henry VI murdered in the Tower of London. Officially, he died of melancholy, but everyone knew he was killed. Henry's son and heir was killed in battle. The direct Lancastrian male line was extinguished.
Edward IV died in 1483, leaving two young sons. His brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector for the boy king Edward V. What happened next destroyed what remained of the Plantagenet dynasty. Richard declared his brother's marriage invalid, claiming Edward IV had been pre-contracted to another woman. This made Edward's sons illegitimate. Richard then took the throne himself as Richard III. The two boys, the princes in the tower, disappeared, almost certainly murdered on Richard's orders, though he never admitted it. This was the ultimate self-destructive act. Richard eliminated his own nephews to seize power, fragmenting what remained of Yorkist support and creating moral revulsion even among his allies. When Henry Tudor, a very distant Lancastrian claimant, invaded in 1485, many Yorkists either stayed neutral or switched sides. Richard was killed at Bosworth Field, his naked body slung over a horse for public display. The Plantagenet extinction. Henry VII, Henry Tudor, became king, marrying Edward IV's daughter Elizabeth to unite the Lancastrian and Yorkist lines. The Wars of the Roses were over. But what had been destroyed in 30 years of civil war? The Plantagenet dynasty was functionally extinct. Henry VIII was only distantly related to the Plantagenet line. He was a Tudor, starting a new dynasty. Most of the senior Plantagenet lines had been eliminated, killed in battle, executed after battles, murdered in prisons, or dying young before producing heirs. The family had bled itself almost to death. Of the numerous descendants of Edward III alive in 1450, very few remained by 1485. The family tree had been pruned with swords until barely any branches remained. The English nobility was decimated. Many great noble families disappeared entirely, their male lines extinguished in battles or executions. How the Plantagenets destroyed themselves. The Wars of the Roses demonstrate several patterns of royal self-destruction, putting family interest above kingdom. Each faction believed its branch should rule because of bloodline. Neither side would compromise because family pride was paramount. Escalating feuds. Initial disagreements about governance became battles for survival. Once blood was spilled, revenge became necessary, creating cycles of violence. Eliminating rivals rather than compromising. Instead of finding political solutions, both sides killed rivals, reducing the available pool of capable leaders. Short-term thinking. Each tactical victory,
Killing a rival, winning a battle, seemed good at the moment, but contributed to long-term dynastic weakness. Betrayal as strategy. Warwick's side-switching, Richard III's usurpation, these momentary advantages destroyed trust and legitimacy, making the system unsustainable. Prioritizing revenge over stability. Margaret of Anjou pursuing vengeance for her husband, Yorkists executing Lancastrians, revenge took precedence over practical governance. The truly tragic aspect is that the Plantagenets had enough capable people to rule successfully. Edward IV was an effective king. Richard III, despite his usurpation, had administrative ability. Various nobles were talented commanders and administrators. But instead of using these talents to strengthen the dynasty, they used them to fight each other. Every capable Plantagenet who died in the Civil War was one less person who could have preserved the dynasty. By the time Henry VII took the throne, he faced an odd problem. There were almost no legitimate Plantagenet claimants left to challenge him because they'd killed each other. The Wars of the Roses is a case study in how a dynasty can self-destruct through internal conflict. The Plantagenets didn't fall to foreign invasion, plague, or incapable leadership. They had capable leaders. That was part of the problem. They were capable of fighting each other effectively. They fell because they couldn't stop fighting themselves. They transformed family succession disputes into existential warfare, eliminated each other systematically, betrayed each other repeatedly, and chose family vendettas over dynastic survival. In doing so, they demonstrated that a royal family can have all the advantages, wealth, power, capable members, and still destroy itself if it turns those advantages against itself.
From the battlefields of English Civil War, we turn to France and the Bourbon dynasty, which destroyed itself through a toxic combination of arrogance, extravagance, and spectacular tone deafness that culminated in revolution and the guillotine. The Bourbon dynasty took the French throne in 1589 when Henry IV converted to Catholicism to end the French wars of religion. "Paris is well worth a mass," he reportedly said. The Bourbons ruled France for over 2 centuries, presiding over France's golden age. Louis XIV, the Sun King, made France the dominant European power. French culture, art, language, and fashion became the standard for all European courts. Versailles, Louis XIV's magnificent palace, was the wonder of the age, copied by monarchs across Europe. France under the Bourbons was wealthy, populous, culturally supreme. The monarchy seemed unassailable. How could such power, such cultural dominance, such wealth end in revolution and regicide? The answer lies in a series of choices that progressively alienated the monarchy from reality and from the French people. Louis XIV created the system that would eventually destroy his dynasty, though he wouldn't live to see it. His construction of Versailles was brilliant politically, but disastrous long-term. By moving the court from Paris to Versailles, Louis isolated the nobility from their regional power bases, making them dependent on royal favor. They had to attend at Versailles to receive positions, pensions, and influence. This worked beautifully for controlling the aristocracy, but it created a bubble of unreality. Versailles became a world unto itself, governed by elaborate etiquette and ritual, increasingly disconnected from France itself. Louis XIV also established absolute monarchy as the French system. L'État, c'est moi, I am the state, may be apocryphal, but it captured his approach. The king was France, and France was the king. No institution could limit royal power. Again, this seemed to work. Louis ruled effectively, expanded French territory, patronized magnificent art and culture, but he established a system where the king's will was absolute and unquestioned. The court was isolated from the country. Elaborate ritual surrounded kingship, elevating it beyond normal human accountability. The nobility were ornamental courtiers rather than functional governing class.
No institutional mechanisms existed to challenge royal decisions. This worked as long as the king was competent. But what happened when the king wasn't? Louis XV became king at age 5 in 1715. He would reign for 59 years, presiding over France's decline from European supremacy to near bankruptcy. Louis XV was not viciously cruel or deliberately destructive. He was simply indolent, pleasure-seeking, and unwilling to make difficult decisions. He famously said, "Après moi, le déluge," after me, the flood, acknowledging problems but refusing to address them. Under Louis XV, France lost the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, surrendering colonial possessions to Britain and establishing Britain as the dominant global power. France suffered military humiliations and enormous debts. The government became increasingly corrupt and inefficient. Royal mistresses, particularly Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry, influenced appointments and policy. Positions were sold to raise revenue. Capable reformers were blocked by entrenched interests. The gap between Versailles and France widened. While peasants struggled with heavy taxation and poor harvests, the court spent lavishly on entertainments, mistresses, and luxuries. The contrast became increasingly offensive. Louis XV's reign showed that the Bourbon system couldn't self-correct. There were no institutional mechanisms to force reform when the king refused it. Capable ministers like Controller General Machaut d'Arnouville tried to reform taxation and reduce privilege, but were blocked by the nobility and abandoned by the king when reform became difficult. Louis XVI became king in 1774, inheriting a country with severe financial problems, social tensions, and a government that hadn't reformed in decades. Louis XVI was well-meaning, pious, interested in science and crafts, but he was also indecisive, easily influenced, unable to maintain support for policies when they became unpopular, and catastrophically naive about politics. He tried to reform. He appointed capable finance ministers, Turgot, then Necker, then Calonne, who proposed necessary but painful reforms, taxing the nobility, reducing court expenses, reforming government efficiency. But each time, when resistance arose, Louis backed down. He couldn't sustain support for reforms when the nobility protested or when his wife Marie Antoinette opposed them. He would appoint a reformer, support reform briefly, then abandon it when opposition intensified. This pattern of attempted reform followed by retreat was worse than never attempting reform. It showed weakness, raised hopes, then dashed them, and convinced people that the system couldn't reform itself. Marie Antoinette didn't cause the French Revolution, but she became its symbol, the embodiment of everything people hated about the royal court. The Austrian-born queen was beautiful, charming, fashion-forward, and completely tone-deaf to French politics and public opinion. She spent enormous sums on clothing, jewelry, gambling, and her private estate at the Petit Trianon. She meddled in politics, usually blocking reforms that would reduce court expenses or nobility privileges. Probably she never said, "Let them eat cake," when told peasants had no bread. But the fact that the quote was believable shows how people perceived her, as utterly disconnected from ordinary people's lives, unable to comprehend their suffering. Her nickname, Madame Deficit, reflected public perception that she was bankrupting France through extravagance. Pamphlets circulated accusing her of sexual depravity, foreign manipulation, and contempt for the French people. Whether fair or not, much propaganda was exaggerated or false. Marie Antoinette became the face of an arrogant, extravagant monarchy that cared nothing for its subjects' welfare.
By 1788, France faced a financial crisis. Years of deficit spending, costly intervention in the American Revolution, and economic problems had created a debt crisis. The government couldn't pay its bills. The traditional solution was raising taxes, but the nobility and clergy, the privileged orders, were largely tax-exempt. The burden fell on the common people, the Third Estate, who were already heavily taxed. Reform required the privileged orders to start paying taxes, but they refused and blocked reform through parliaments, noble-dominated courts. Louis XVI, desperate and out of options, called the Estates General, a representative assembly that hadn't met since 1614, to approve new taxes. This was an admission of failure. The absolute monarch was admitting he couldn't govern alone. The Estates General met in May 1789. The Third Estate, commoners, demanded voting by head rather than by order, which would give them majority. When the king tried to enforce voting by order, the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly and vowed not to disband until France had a constitution. Louis XVI initially tried to resist, then vacillated, then gave in. This pattern, resistance, hesitation, capitulation, characterized his response to the revolution. What followed showed the Bourbons at their self-destructive worst. July 1789, Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille. Louis XVI asked a courtier if it was a revolt. "No, sire, it is a revolution," came the reply. Louis's diary entry for that day simply said, "Rien," nothing. He'd been hunting, and the hunt had been unsuccessful. The revolution had begun, and the king thought nothing significant had happened. October 1789, a women's march to Versailles forced the royal family to return to Paris. They were now effectively prisoners of the revolution, though nominally still king and queen. June 1791, Louis and Marie Antoinette attempted to flee France, hoping to reach the Austrian border and rally foreign support. They were caught at Varennes and brought back to Paris. This flight attempt shattered any remaining trust. They'd proven they were willing to abandon France and ally with foreign powers against their own people. 1792. As war with Austria and Prussia began, Louis was suspected, correctly, of hoping France would lose so foreign powers could restore his authority. He was suspended from royal functions. August 1792. The monarchy was formally abolished. Louis and his family were imprisoned. January 1793, Louis XVI was tried by the National Convention, convicted of treason, and guillotined in the Place de la Révolution. He died with dignity, but he died nonetheless, a king executed by his own subjects. October 1793, Marie Antoinette followed him to the guillotine, having endured months of imprisonment and a show trial focusing on lurid, probably false accusations. Their young son, Louis XVII, died in prison in 1995, probably from neglect and harsh conditions. How did the Bourbons destroy themselves? Through a systematic pattern of failures. Isolation. Versailles created physical and psychological distance from France. The monarchy lost touch with its subjects' lives and concerns. Arrogance. The assumption that royal will was sufficient, that the people existed to serve the monarchy rather than the monarchy existing to serve the people. Inability to reform. The system Louis XIV created couldn't adapt. When reform became necessary, institutional and cultural barriers prevented it. Fiscal irresponsibility. Decades of deficit spending, costly wars, court extravagance, and tax privileges for the wealthy created an unsustainable financial situation. Weakness at crucial moments. Louis XVI's indecision and tendency to back down just when firmness was needed destroyed his credibility with both reformers and conservatives. Tone deafness. The court continued its extravagant lifestyle even as economic crisis mounted, showing contempt for public suffering. Betrayal of trust. The flight to Varennes proved the monarchy's fundamental disloyalty to France, destroying any possibility of constitutional monarchy.
The Bourbon catastrophe shows that a dynasty can destroy itself not through dramatic sins, but through accumulated failures. They isolated themselves from reality until they couldn't see problems clearly. They resisted necessary reforms until reform became revolution. They prioritized privilege and tradition over adaptation and survival. They showed arrogance when they should have shown humility, weakness when they should have shown strength. The French Revolution didn't happen to the Bourbons. The Bourbons created the conditions that made revolution inevitable and their own destruction nearly certain. Every choice, building Versailles, maintaining noble privilege, resisting fiscal reform, allowing court extravagance, fleeing to Varennes, seemed reasonable within the narrow perspective of preserving royal power. Each choice contributed to the dynasty's destruction. Louis XVI, waiting for the guillotine, had plenty of time to reflect on how his dynasty had brought itself to this moment. The choices of his ancestors, combined with his own failures, had created a situation where the most powerful monarchy in Europe could be overthrown by its own subjects and its king executed as a traitor. The Bourbons proved that no amount of historical glory, cultural achievement, or traditional authority can save a dynasty that loses touch with reality and refuses to adapt to changing circumstances. We return now to an even more extreme case of genetic self-destruction than the Habsburgs, the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, which practiced sibling marriage for nearly 3 centuries, creating perhaps the most tangled family tree in history, and ending with Cleopatra, brilliant, capable, and the last of a line that had exhausted itself genetically and politically. The Ptolemaic dynasty began not with ancient Egyptian pharaohs, but with Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's Macedonian generals. When Alexander died in 323 BCE and his empire was carved up among his generals, Ptolemy claimed Egypt. Ptolemy I was a capable ruler who established a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. He made Alexandria the capital, one of the ancient world's great cities, home to the famous library and lighthouse. The early Ptolemies were energetic, capable rulers who made Egypt wealthy and powerful. But they also established a custom that would ultimately destroy them: sibling marriage. Why sibling marriage? The Ptolemies adopted sibling marriage partly to legitimate their rule. They were Macedonian Greeks ruling Egypt, foreigners to the native population. Egyptian pharaonic tradition included sibling marriage, though the reality was more complex. By marrying siblings, the Ptolemies claimed to be continuing pharaonic tradition. But there was also a practical political reason: property and power. Each marriage to an outside dynasty meant sharing power and territory. Sibling marriage kept everything in the family. The early Ptolemies also married outside the immediate family, cousins, other dynasties, so the genetic impact wasn't immediately catastrophic. But over generations, as sibling marriage became standard practice, the genetic consequences accumulated. The Ptolemaic family tree is so complex that scholars still debate exact relationships. Multiple marriages, divorces, remarriages, and the fact that the same names were reused constantly. There were 15 King Ptolemies and 7 Queen Cleopatras, creates immense confusion. Here's a sample of the tangled relationships. Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe II, after she'd been married to and divorced from other men, including another brother. Ptolemy IV married his full sister Arsinoe III. They had a son, Ptolemy V. Ptolemy VIII married his niece Cleopatra III, then also married her daughter Cleopatra III, his own grandniece and stepdaughter. He was simultaneously married to mother and daughter, both named Cleopatra. His children were simultaneously his grandchildren through his wife, who was his niece. The genetic coefficient of inbreeding rivaled or exceeded that of the Spanish Habsburgs. The family tree loops back on itself so many times that it resembles a tangled knot more than a tree. The consequences. Unlike the Habsburgs, we have less detailed information about the Ptolemies' physical deformities because we lack autopsies and detailed contemporary descriptions. But we know the dynasty suffered. Declining fertility, later Ptolemies had increasing difficulty producing heirs. Many marriages were childless or produced children who died young.
Political incapacity, several later Ptolemies were weak, ineffective rulers, easily manipulated by courtiers, foreign powers, or family members. Mental instability, some Ptolemies showed signs of serious mental illness or were described as cruel and erratic.
Murderous family dynamics. The Ptolemies regularly murdered each other. Brothers killing brothers, mothers killing sons, siblings assassinating siblings. Whether this was purely political or had some genetic component to violent instability is debatable, but the family was exceptionally murderous even by royal standards. Physical weakness. Later Ptolemies were often described as weak or sickly, unable to lead armies personally, a serious problem for Hellenistic monarchs. This brings us to Cleopatra VII. Yes, the Cleopatra, one of history's most famous women. Born in 69 BCE, she was the daughter of Ptolemy XII and possibly Cleopatra V, who might have been his sister or cousin. Records are unclear. Cleopatra herself was the product of at least several generations of close inbreeding. Her genetic coefficient of inbreeding was almost certainly very high. And yet, Cleopatra was brilliant, capable, and politically astute. She spoke multiple languages. She was the first Ptolemy in 300 years to bother learning Egyptian. She was educated in philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. She was a skilled politician who navigated Roman politics adeptly. How did someone from such a depleted genetic stock turn out so capable? Partly luck of genetic lottery. Inbreeding increases risk but doesn't guarantee defects. Partly perhaps an outside genetic contribution somewhere in her lineage that records don't capture. But Cleopatra faced an impossible situation. She was the last viable Ptolemaic ruler of a dynasty and kingdom that were both exhausted. Cleopatra married her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, aged 10, when she became co-ruler in 51 BCE. This was the traditional sibling marriage, but it was political only. She was in her late teens, he was a child, and they were rivals for power, not spouses in any meaningful sense. She fought a civil war against Ptolemy XIII and his advisors, allying with Julius Caesar, becoming his lover. Ptolemy XIII drowned during the war. Cleopatra then married her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, aged 11, another nominal sibling marriage. She probably had him poisoned when he became politically inconvenient. She then had 4 children, 1 Caesarion with Julius Caesar, 3 with Mark Antony. None through sibling marriage. By this point, the Ptolemaic practice had essentially ended, Cleopatra having no suitable sibling husband and preferring powerful Roman lovers who could help preserve her kingdom. Cleopatra's story ends famously. Allied with Mark Antony against Octavian, later Augustus, defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, and suicide, probably by poison, not an asp, in 30 BCE, after Octavian's victory. Octavian had Caesarion murdered, eliminating a potential rival as Caesar's son. Cleopatra's children with Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Antony's wife, Octavia. They disappeared from history. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province. 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule ended not with a successful heir, but with a last brilliant ruler who couldn't overcome the accumulated weight of her dynasty's genetic and political exhaustion. The Ptolemies destroyed themselves through genetic isolation. 3 centuries of primarily sibling marriage created genetic problems that weakened the dynasty. Political isolation. The Ptolemies remained Greek rulers of an Egyptian population, never fully integrating, always outsiders. Murderous succession. The regular pattern of family members murdering each other for power exhausted the pool of capable rulers. Inability to adapt. By Cleopatra's time, the Ptolemaic kingdom couldn't compete with Rome. Earlier adaptation might have created a subordinate but surviving kingdom. Instead, they fought and lost. Exhausted resources. Centuries of civil wars, luxury, and court expenses left the kingdom financially and militarily weak. Cleopatra's tragedy. Cleopatra's personal tragedy was being brilliant enough to see the problems, but unable to solve them. She understood that Ptolemaic Egypt couldn't stand alone against Rome. Her alliances with Caesar and then Antony were attempts to preserve Egyptian independence through partnership with Roman power. But she was playing a game she ultimately couldn't win. Rome was too strong, Octavian too capable, and Egypt too weakened by centuries of Ptolemaic misrule. Her suicide ended the dynasty her ancestors had created through sibling marriage, maintained through murder, and exhausted through genetic and political isolation. She was the brilliant last bloom of a plant whose roots had been poisoned by its own cultivation practices.